This lecture is over Chapter 10, Jacksonian Democracy, 1820 to 1840. It goes with Unit 3. This is a longer lecture and has a lot of detailed political information that can sometimes be hard to grasp. So the Jacksonian era marks this significant period in American history. It's going to lay the foundation for a transformative presidency of Andrew Jackson. So beginning in the very late 18th century, the United States had experienced a series of political, economic, and social changes. And this is going to be the stage that Jackson's able to rise up to power. So this era saw the emergence of different political ideologies. We're going to talk about Jeffersonian republicanism and Jeffersonian democracy, as well as the expansion of suffrage and really the growth of popular participation in politics. Economically, the nation is going to witness the rise of industry and the spread of a market capitalism, which is going to bring about prosperity, but also is going to create this inequality. Socially, before the Jacksonian era, it was characterized as some important movements such as the Great Awakening, which is going to push for social reform, and different events and ideas are going to shape this path towards Jackson's presidency, and it's going to actually be why this era is named after him. Okay, so like we were talking about, in the early 1800s, American politics begin to shift as these new ideas emerge, and the Democratic-Republican Party is going to start to break apart. Remember, we had the Federalist Party, which was more your elites, and then the Democratic Party, which would kind of be associated with the common man. In 1824, you had these influential leaders. You have Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, and John Quincy Adams. So they are going to create this new party called National Republican Party. The leaders believe that the federal government should play a very strong and active role in shaping the future of the country. And remember, the Civil War is going to have to do with federal rights and state rights, okay? So you have federal government and then you have the state governments. So they want the federal government to be what determines the future of the country. They thought that if you had a united national government, it could help the economy grow and it could bring people together across all different states and regions. So one of the main goals of the National Republicans was to improve the transportation systems. They're just starting to have railway and canals and the steamboat. So they want to improve all of the transportation systems. And at the time, roads and canals were essential for farmers and merchants to move their goods from one state to another and have this interstate trade. The National Republicans want the government to invest in building and maintaining these systems so that trade's more efficient and easier. The idea is part of a larger plan called the American System. So the American System also included creating a national bank. This is to help stabilize the economy and use protective tariffs. Remember, tariffs are taxes on imported goods. And taxes always come back to the American people paying. First the businesses, and then they raise their prices to be competitive and to not lose money. And so the American people eventually pay on these tariffs. So these policies are going to be especially popular with the merchant and the banking class. They want this stable economy, they want better infrastructure, and all of this will help support their futures and their careers. Well, the National Republicans also said their ideas were similar to the early Federalist Party, which had also supported a strong central government. So, by focusing on the national unity and the economic development, the National Republican Party hoped to prevent the country from dividing into separate regions and having separate interests and not all working for the common good. So their ideas appealed to this growing middle class and to the southern states that needed better transportation and needed government financial support. So this shift in political thinking is a very important turning point in American history. Okay, so just very quickly on the Whig Party. So this is kind of an answer to this new National Republican Party. So it's going to be a new political party, and it's going to be called the Whig Party. It's going to be an opponent to the Democrat Republicans, and it's especially supported by Andrew Jackson. So the Whigs quickly become a major force in American politics, and they play this important role in shaping the country. So unlike the Democrats who believed in a limited government and followed the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, the Whigs support a more active role of the federal government, especially when it came to helping the economy grow. So the Whigs believe that government should be involved in commercial activities, which is going to be economics. Anything commercial means economics, and support industrial development, right? Because we're right on the brink of the Industrial Revolution, which happens in England first and then will come to America. So the Whigs believe that government should involve in all these different activities. They should support industrial development, and they wanted to create a national bank that could help regulate the economy and make it more stable. They believed in urbanization, which means that you have the problem with industrialization was that they had all of the people come from the rural areas, the farming areas, and they come into the cities, and the cities don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the roads, they don't have the housing, they don't have the sanitary, they don't have anything that they need. And all these people come in, and that's going to create a huge issue during the Industrial Revolution. So they are wanting to create progress in the country, and these ideas are going to really appeal to the people who are already living in the cities and working in businesses or banking. And people who are working in businesses or banking, these are going to be the upper class. So one major difference, though, between the Whigs and the Democrats was how they viewed westward expansion. That's a whole other issue we have going on. We have industrialization in the cities, from the Appalachian Mountains forward to the original colonies. And then we also have the idea of, now that we have bought the Louisiana Purchase, we have the idea of westward expansion and the Indians. So you've got really two unique dynamics going on at the same time. So while the Democrats supported the idea of settlers moving freely into these western lands, which there's Indians on those western lands, the Whigs were more concerned about the problem that could come from uncontrolled settlement. So they wanted to reform those laws that would make expansion more organized and better planned instead of everybody just going west. So those new communities, they wanted them to grow in a safe, structured way because they do have limited resources. The people going that way don't necessarily know how to farm that type of land, and you have the Indians, and you have the terrain, and you have other issues. So throughout the 1830s and 40s, the Whig and the Democrats are going to be competing fiercely in different elections. So this rivalry is going to help shape political debates at the time, and it's going to lead to a development of a different ideology about how the government should work. So the rise of the Whig Party showed Americans were thinking more deeply about the role of government in their lives and how to keep that role of government in their lives as they were trying to get the country to grow and prosper. Okay, so we have James Monroe's presidency. Starting around 1816, the ideas of this national republicanism began to grow. Monroe, he's a Democratic Republican, but he supported a strong federal government, and he worked with John Quincy Adams to shape and create a very assertive foreign policy. So one major event was Andrew Jackson's raid in Florida, which pressured Spain to sign the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819. So this treaty gave Florida to the U.S. and clarified borders with Spanish-held Mexico. So Morón also supported independence movements in Latin America. In 1823, he introduces the Monroe Doctrine, and this is what you are going to need to understand, because the Monroe Doctrine continues through next semester and will be tested on heavily. So the Monroe Doctrine declares that European powers should not interfere in the Western Hemisphere. So you have the Eastern Hemisphere, which is Europe and on, and then you have the Western Hemisphere, which is the Americas. And the Western Hemisphere, that's where you get Westernization and all these other words. They're referring to the Americas. So what Monroe is saying is that this is a warning that the Western Hemisphere in all areas is under U.S. protection. U.S. foreign policy declaring that Europe nations should no longer try and colonize, because remember, you had Portuguese in Brazil, you had the Spanish, you had the French, you had the English. That's one of the reasons for the American Revolution. So what the Monroe Doctrine says is basically, stay out of our hemisphere. We'll stay out of yours, you stay out of ours. This is where we start lead into isolationism and just handling our own business and not being as global as we should be. So that doctrine will go all through World War I. So that's what it basically says is stay out of, to the Eastern Hemisphere, all those countries, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. And it's a warning to let them know that if you attempt to come into our space, our Western Hemisphere, we will consider it a threat and we will consider it an act of war. So the Monroe Doctrine also helps create this idea of nationalism, and that the U.S. was ready to assert whatever they needed to assert to protect their hemisphere. Okay, the Missouri Compromise. This is in 1819. So you have, remember, you have free states, you have slave states, and all these different areas are trying to figure out how to come into a union. So in 1890, Missouri asked to join the United States as a slave state. So this is going to cause a major debate in Congress because it would upset the balance between free states and slave states. At the time, there's 11 free states and 11 slave states. So New York Representative Talmadge, he proposes that Missouri should only be allowed to join if it stopped bringing in new slaves and eventually ended slavery. Southern leaders are going to strongly oppose this idea, saying it's unconstitutional and attacked on their right. Northern leaders support it, arguing that slavery was wrong and went against American values. The proposal passed in the House but failed in the Senate. So around the same time, Maine applies to become a free state. This gave Congress a chance to compromise in 1820 because this will keep it even. So the Missouri Compromise was passed. It allowed Missouri to enter as a slave state and Maine to enter as a free state, which kept that balance. It also created a rule for future territories. Slavery would be banned in the Louisiana Territory north of the parallel of 3630 latitude line, except in Missouri. Okay, so the election of 1824. This is a major turning point in American politics. This election is the first time candidates start using a visual campaign materials like poster, buttons, hats, and they're trying to promote themselves. These items are going to help spread their message and connect with voters in a more personal way. So at the same time, you have voting rights expanded as many states remove property requirements, allowing more white men, especially from the working class backgrounds, to vote. However, free black men and women were still denied the right to vote. And it's going to be 100 some odd years. So showing that political inclusion was still limited. So the election features 4 major candidates: Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay, all part of the same party, the Democratic Republican Party. But they represented different regions of that party and different ideologies of that party. So this is also showing how the party is beginning to split, because the party should have one ideology, right? So Jackson was a war hero, and he was popular with everyday Americans. Adams was well known, and he had the experience of politics, and he was also the son of President John Adams. That's why we refer to him as Quincy. So Crawford was a strong supporter of the South, and Clay promoted the American system. So Jackson won the popular and electoral votes, but not the majority needed to win. So according to the Constitution, the House of Representatives had to choose the winner from the top 3 candidates. So Clay, who was no longer in the running because he was the lowest, he's going to use his influence to help Adams win. So Adams then made Clay his Secretary of State, leading Jackson's supporters to accuse him of a corrupt bargain. So this controversy led to major political shifts. Jackson supporters began forming a new movement that would become the Democratic Party. The election showed how the Electoral College could override the popular vote and raised questions about fairness. And in honesty, we're still dealing with the Electoral College. All the way back to this point, there's still tons of questions about, is the Electoral College in modern elections still the way we need to do things? So it also is going to set the stage for Jackson's victory in 1828. And this is going to change American politics for years to come. All right, so John Quincy Adams, he's the son of President Adams. He focused on building a stronger and more unified nation. He believed the federal government should actively support the country's growth, and not just through laws, but by investing in the country's transportation, education, science, and their economy. So his ideas were based on what was called the American system, which aimed to connect the country and boost trade. Adam wanted to keep the second bank of the United States. He felt that this would help to stabilize the economy. He also supported protective tariffs, which are taxes on import goods, to help American businesses compete with the foreign products. So these policies helped the North, but were unpopular in the South, where people depended on imports. So beyond economics, Adam had a big plan for education and for science. He proposed creating a national university, a national observatory for astronomy, a naval academy to train military leaders. He also pushed for federal funding of roads, bridges, canals to link different parts of the country and to support westward expansion. So he had very ambitious goals. He faced very strong opposition from Andrew Jackson supporters. They accused him, of course, of winning through a corrupt bargain, what he had with Henry Clay. Henry Clay was going to influence, he was a House Speaker, and he was going to influence people to vote the way he wanted, which was for Adams. So this makes it very hard for Adams to gain public support and pass a lot of the ideas he had, even though they were good ideas. Okay, so the election of 828. You had very strong support for Jackson, and you had a group that's going to call themselves the Jacksonian Democrats. So there was good support for both candidates, and this election is going to become very, very vicious. Martin Van Buren, he is the coordinator for the Democrat National campaign. And his idea that is actually successful is going to be to appeal to the mass. So he paints Jackson as this man who's out for the common person, the common man. So when Jackson gets elected, he really has this cross-section of voters from different social stances. He has the elite, he has the common man, and this helps him shift his power from states that were just more dependent on people who they knew, whereas Jackson was somebody who they did not know as well, but he ran his campaign on the fact that he would protect the common man. So you also have party loyalty. Once he wins, he's going to overturn different appointments, and he's going to appoint people who were true to him. And he's going to also expand the powers of the presidency. He's going to be very hostile to the Native Americans, and he was a strong supporter of slavery. Okay, so let's talk about the Jackson era. So his main time is 1820, 1830. He's going to bring major changes. He's going to focus on what he says, the common man. He's going to reduce the influence of wealthy elites. He is going to help the Western settlers, the small farmers, and pioneers that are very frustrated by the land policies that they believe only favor the rich. He's going to have wage workers, mechanics. He's going to create a whole new economy. He's going to begin to form unions and demand fair treatment. You're going to have the mechanics union push for a 10-hour workday. So Jackson's supporters opposed charter corporations, which were created by special laws and gave wealthy individuals access to money and success and special favors. So suspicion is going to grow towards these secretive groups like the Freemasons and lead into the anti-Masonic movement, which accused the Freemasons of having too much influence in the government. So when Jackson gets elected in 1828, he becomes the symbol of this movement. He's the first president from the Western frontier. He was popular because of this tough image, his military background, and his belief in limited government. And he used his veto power more than any other president before him to block programs that he saw as favoring the elite. So he's going to appoint to the Supreme Court Roger B. Taney. He's going to be the Chief Justice, and he's really going to pretty much do whatever Jackson tells him to do. So Jackson's ideology is more states' rights. So Jackson democracy expanded political participation, challenged the privilege, and gave more power to the presidency. However, Jackson also supported slavery and pushed for Native American removal, which this is showing that his vision of democracy had limits. Okay, so one of the first things he's going to deal with is what's called the Bank War. So this is one of the biggest conflicts in his presidency. The focus is on the Second Bank of the United States. It's a powerful institution and was led by Nicholas Beidel. The bank controlled much of the nation's money and was partly owned by wealthy Americans and foreign investors. So many people believed it had too much power, too much control over the economy and politics. So in 1832, Biddle asked Congress to renew the bank's charter. A charter is kind of your laws for that situation. So Congress approved it, and the Supreme Court had already ruled the bank was constitutional. But Jackson vetoed the bill, saying the bank gave unfair power to the wealthy and threatened the democracy. So his veto message was popular with ordinary citizens who distrust these elite institutions. So after winning re-election in 1832, Jackson took action. He removed the federal money from the bank and placed it into selective banks he called pet banks. By 1833, the government had stopped accepting payments from the second bank, which will lead to its collapse. However, Jackson's decision and how he did things had serious consequences. Without a central bank to control the lending and the currency and risky investments and inflation increase, in 1837, this is going to cause the economy to crash in what's called the Panic of 1837. With bank failures, businesses are going to close, you're going to have high unemployment, and Jackson's fight against the bank expanded presidential powers, but also showed the risk of removing national institutions without having anything to replace them. So during Jackson's presidency, he's also going to have issues with slavery. So he believes that a major part of American society, especially in the South, depended on slavery. Jackson himself was a slaveholder. He promoted the rights of the common man, but his policy excluded enslaved and free black Americans. So the Southern economy was booming because of the cotton farming, which became more profitable after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. It's going to make it easier and more powerful to produce the cotton, but it's also going to lead to a greater demand for enslaved labor. So enslaved Africans worked in these harsh conditions, doing both field work and skilled jobs. They cooked, they were nurses, they had carpentry, they were housemaids. They did all different types of jobs. But the reason that they were still considered slaves is that they were property, and this is going to be important in the Civil War. So they're considered property, meaning that their slaveholders can buy, sell, punish, do whatever they want. It's their property. So the domestic slave trade was well organized, and slave markets became common gathering places for white men. So at this point, we don't have the international slave trade. You can't buy and bring in slaves to the country, but you could trade within the country the slaves that you already had. So 1 in 3 enslaved children were separated from their families due to this westward migration. Jackson's administration, they supported states' rights. So that meant that the southern states could do what they wanted with slavery, and the southern states are going to rely highly on slavery. So Jackson's administration, so they support states' rights. Okay, so this means for the southern states to expand slavery without any type of interference with the federal government. So free black people, especially in the South, faced constant threats of mistreatment and being forced back into slavery, although that they were actually free. In the North, some states allowed black citizens to vote and attend school, but racism, discrimination, all of that is still a widespread issue. So Jackson helped form the American Colonization Society, and you're not going to see much about this. This starts in 1816. It is this idea of sending the free black Americans, not the slaves, the free black Americans back to Africa. So Congress is going to give money to support this effort. And this actually, they're going to do this, and it's going to actually lead to the founding of Liberia, an African country. So these actions show how limited the idea of freedom was during Jackson's time, and how the country, you can already see the division that they are having between slavery. Okay, slavery and the national development. So obviously it played a huge role in the national development of the country. So people in the North are going to believe that slavery is bad. they never really saw slavery firsthand, but they definitely benefited for them. So even though the North does not believe in slavery, they're connected to slavery. So northern businesses shipped cotton. So the North is the industrial part, and the South is more the raw material, the picking the cotton and shipping the cotton to the North, okay, to make a shirt. So northern businesses shipped cotton grown by enslaved workers. And everyday items, like I said, shirts, were made from slave-produced cotton. So there is this connection between the North and the South. The North cannot be successful if it does not have the cotton from the South, and the cotton needs the North to buy, the South needs the North to buy the cotton. So as capitalism grew, so the demand for slavery, so you could produce more cotton. So the South built its economy around slave labor, while the North relied on free labor but needed the system of the South. So these two systems were very different, but they were also very connected. The North and the South depended on each other economically. Even though their values are different, they still have this economic bond that one cannot succeed without the other. So in 1860, the relationship had changed. The North had become less dependent on the South, while the South still relied heavily on the North trade and their industry. So this imbalance that is developed, again, this is 1860, Civil War 65. This is going to add tension between these regions and will also help set the stage for the Civil War. Okay, so let's look at slavery and the laws of the nation. So beginning with the United States, slavery was deeply connected to national laws and policies. You have the Ordinance of 1787. This banned the importation of slaves into what was called the Old Northwest and parts of the Old Southwest. So this is showing a very early attempt to limit slavery in new territories. In 1807, Congress took a huge step by outlawing the Atlantic slave trade. So this is stopping the importation of enslaved people from other countries, which we had talked about. But it does not stop slavery within the country. Okay, the Constitution protected slavery in states where it already existed. So those slave states are protected by the Constitution. Again, slaves were considered property. So free states couldn't abolish slavery nationwide because it had the protection of the Constitution. And only the federal government could regulate slavery in U.S. territories. So this becomes a huge issue. One part of the Constitution is the 3/5 clause. It gave Southern states extra political power because they could count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation. So this is going to help them have more elective officials, and hopefully what they were attempting was that they would always have Southern presidents and the South would have the influence in Congress because they could count their slaves toward having elective officials represent them. So in northern states, they passed personal liberty laws to protect free black Americans from being kidnapped or forced back into slavery. These laws are going to show, again, the resistance to slavery, but the federal system still protected slaves and slave owners in those different parts of the country that allowed slaves. Okay, so we're going to flip to Jackson and the Native American people. All right, so the federal government's relationship with Native American tribes was continuously being an issue, right? Because they want westward expansion, and you've got the Native Americans that you've made treaties with, and you have pushed them west and pushed them west, and now you're bringing pioneers and settlers to go and take that land again. So you're obviously going to have issues. So Jackson believes that westward expansion was the key to helping the common man, especially the pioneers who wanted to move west and wanted to start creating productive cities and areas. So he saw Native Americans as an obstacle to progress. Okay, Western expansion is seen as progress. All right, so we're going to look at Georgia. So in Georgia, he believes that the Native Americans are this obstacle. He wants the Georgia land. And in 1802, the federal government had promised to remove all Native Americans from Georgia. But by 1826, it still hadn't been complete. So Jackson's going to pressure the government and start to push these tribes out of Georgia. All right, so President John Quincy Adams had objected to this policy, but tensions were growing. Georgia was Cherokee land, so the Cherokees had been on Georgia. And what happens is they discover gold on this Cherokee land, so they really want the Indians gone. So Georgia passed laws that took away Cherokee rights and refused to protect their land from any white prospectors. So you have the Indian land, and Indians, their culture, they did not believe that anybody could own the land. They just believed that it was your duty to protect the land, but you could not own the land. So they have this land in Georgia, the Cherokee Nation, and they find gold, and Georgia now passes these laws that says, hey, yeah, any white prospector, these are going to be people looking for gold, they can go onto your land, they can dig it up, they can find the gold, they can do whatever they want, because the Indians aren't leaving. So Jackson believes that these treaties with the Native American were dangerous and allowed them to harm settlers. So his views and his actions are going to lead to complete removal of many tribes. And this removal is going to eventually lead to what's known as the Trail of Tears. So here, let's flip to the next one. So the Cherokees, and again, we're focused on Georgia. So the Cherokee Nation is going to take legal action to support their land and their rights. So they filed two Supreme Court cases, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831. So you have John Marshall is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So he ruled that the Cherokee were a domestic dependent nation and couldn't sue in federal court. Still, he acknowledged that they had rights to their land. So he is saying that they are domestic, friendly, they're dependent on America, and they're their own nation. So nation is when you have like-minded people, okay, that have the same cultures and want the same thing. Like America is also a nation because Americans all have the same ideas of America. Okay, so they say, no, you can't sue in federal court, but you do have rights to your land. So the next year, Worcester versus Georgia, 1832. The court ruled that Georgia laws had no power within Cherokee territory. So Georgia could not allow white settlers onto their territory. Georgia had no laws. So the Cherokee Indians cannot sue, but they do have rights to their territory, and Georgia cannot enforce Georgia laws on their independent Cherokee territory. So the federal government could deal with Native nations. So they could only do so much, is what I'm saying. Okay, the federal government could not get the Cherokees to leave because the Supreme Court said, yes, the Cherokees do have rights, but they can't sue. They're not allowed to sue. And then the next case in 1832 says, hey, Georgia, you have no power to do these things within Cherokee territory. All right, so the decision is based on what's called tribal sovereignty, meaning that the native tribes had the right to govern themselves. So you have these laws which are basically saying, hey, Georgia can't remove the Cherokees from their territory, and you cannot go onto their territory and take their gold. They have rights to defend their territory. So this was the ruling that came down. But Jackson is not going to enforce it. He refuses to enforce the ruling. He wants the gold. He wants the Indians gone. So he continues to push for the removal of Native Americans from their land. John Marshall had made his decision and now let him enforce it. And what happens is Jackson's defiance. So Vice President Martin Van Buren, he supports, of course, the removal efforts because he's going to support Jackson. He argued that Native Americans couldn't adapt to white society and that relocation was the most humane way. And they end up, against the law, forcing the removal in the Trail of Tears. So this really shows that even though there were legal victories for the Native tribes, they were in their legal rights, they won through court, they were still ignored by federal leaders, and federal leaders did what they wanted, and they removed them. So in 1830, the Cherokee Nation, like I said, they went through the courts like they were supposed to, and they end up receiving what's called the Indian Removal Act. And what's going to happen is they're going to begin the Trail of Tears, removing them west. It's going to include other Choctaw and Creeks from Oklahoma, and everybody is going to be moved on what's called the Trail of Tears and marched from their homelands westward. And it's going to be a really bad time. They are marched with military leaders, supporting them, so they have to leave. You can see in the picture they're doing it in winter. They're going to have many, many people die. And so they're being moved west, but then again, that territory is going to eventually be taken. Okay, so history remaking of the Indian societies. So U.S. policy had encouraged Native Americans to adopt American customs and lifestyles. This is called the Americanization of the Indian tribes, being that they needed to dress like Americans, act like Americans, and assimilate into American culture, which means whatever culture they had, they needed to leave behind and just assimilate into what the white American culture was. So many white Americans believe that Native people couldn't adapt to civilization because they're called uncivilized, okay? Because they don't follow the white man European laws and rules, which is determined what civilization was, being civilized. So if the Native Americans don't assimilate and become Americans and act like the white Americans, they can't ever have land. They can't ever be proper. And so Andrew Jackson is going to tell Congress that in 1833 that the Native Americans, they lack intelligence, they lack morals, they lack the desire to develop the land. And that this is why they have to be removed. So American literature, books, is also going to help by painting the Native Americans as savages. So Jackson's policies, which were originally more peaceful treaties, are going to be forced removal. And this, of course, is going to lead to the loss of the native lands and their culture. So even though all of this happens, Native Americans like the Comanches, they're going to adapt. They're going to rebuild their agricultural lifestyles. They're going to trade crops, horses, guns, and even some slaves with Americans. So by 1840, they had formed a Comanche empire. They were one of the most powerful forces in the Southern Plains, and they were proof that Native societies could thrive and could adapt. But Jackson's removal policies are still going to cause lasting harm. It's going to replace this coexistence with displacement, and it's just going to leave a legacy of suffering to these Native communities. So like I said, Jackson justifies his policies as being the humane solution. His administration is marked by this shift of coexistence and treaty making to forced displacement and cultural erasing the culture of the Native Americans. Okay, so the growth of sectional tensions. So you have the North and the South, like I talked about before, that are both are growing quickly and both are needing each other, but again, have very different ideologies about slavery. So at this time, you have cotton prices, they're dropping to the levels seen in 1815. Southern planters are struggling financially to survive. Many sold off their enslaved people, their land, their homes. Small farms are being hit the hardest. They don't have the money to compete with these large plantations. And the North was industrializing and moving towards free labor, wage labor, while the South is still defending slavery as a necessary for their economic way of life. So Southern elites are feeling mistreated by the federal government, and they're worried about how the public is changing their attitudes towards slavery, which is going to have a direct impact on their economic success. So to make up for these fallen prices, planters plant more land. But this is going to, when you overplant the land, and you'll see this after World War I during the Great Depression, you tear up the land and the soil can't be produced over and over and over again. You actually get less of a production of your crop when you do not allow the land to rest. So these are going to be more stress factors that are going to lead to the break between the North and the South. All right, so let's talk about the nullification crisis. So what happens is the Southern has strong opposition to this protective tariff, which began in 1816. When Congress passes this tariff, it really is meant to help the American manufacturers. Well, American manufacturers was held in the South. So it does help the northern industries, but at the same time, it is going to hurt the southern planters who rely on these imported goods and exported cotton because that's their economic crop, is the cotton. So the Southerners, they feel that the tariff was unfair. They feel like the North really has this favor with the government. So in 1828, the Congress passed a tariff of abominations, which raised the taxes even more. So Southern leaders, especially in South Carolina, they become outraged. They said the tariff is unconstitutional and it hurt the Southern trade. So John Calhoun, he's going to kind of use what we saw with Locke's social contract theory that overturned the monarchy. So Calhoun wrote the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. So he argues that the federal government was created by the states, and the states had the right to reject federal law that harmed them. This idea becomes known as nullification. So South Carolina threatens to secede from the Union if the tariff wasn't repealed. This led to what this time period will be called the nullification. So in 1833, what happens is the crisis is going to be resolved with a compromise tariff and a strong response from President Jackson, who is not happy about any of this, because this idea of rejecting what he has said on a state level and state justification, it of course undermines his federal authority. So in 1832, South Carolina passed what was called the Ordinance of Nullification, declaring that the tariffs of 1828 and 1832, which were federal tariffs by Jackson, were illegal within their state. So these tariffs that raised taxes on imported goods, which hurt the Southern economy. So the South Carolina, like I said, they believe they're unfair, and that all of this favors the North, so they're going to ignore this tariff in their state. And of course, this is going to make Jackson furious because, like I said, it undermines his federal authority. So let's talk about the effects. So the crisis is going to create this major conflict between state rights and federal power. Federal is the government, the presidency, and state is each state has their governor, their different houses, and it's going to lead to another issue with the idea of what are state rights and what is federal rights, which eventually leads to the Civil War. So this is just one more thing planting this seed of division between the North and the South. This is also going to disrupt Jackson's second term plans, and it actually leads to the creation of the Whig Party that we talked about at the very beginning. So what are some of the results of this? Well, in 1833, Henry Clay and John Calhoun worked on this compromise tariff of 1833, which eventually lowered the tariffs, the taxes, over a 10-year period. And South Carolina accepted that deal, which ended the crisis for the moment. But this is going to be an issue going forward. And then why does all of this matter? Well, it matters because it shows how fragile the Union is at this point, and how this debate over what is a state right and what is a federal right, where this all comes to, and this ideology of what is state and what is federal is all going to lead to the Civil War. All right, so the last thing that we are going to discuss is the social movements that come out of this time period. You have the abolitionist movement, which is the idea of getting rid of slavery, the institution of slavery. It's going to be led, of course, by the Northern Christians. They're going to play a huge role in it, and they're going to gain some traction with 1831, William Lloyd Garrison. He creates this newspaper called The Liberator. It discusses anti-slavery. This, of course, is done in the North. And then you have another publication by Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave, and he's going to write his autobiography in 1845. And this is huge because slaves weren't allowed to read or write, and here you have a former slave who becomes free and talks about the horrible things that happened during slavery. So this movement is also going to have some growth eventually in the South, of course, resistance first, and it's going to be the northern states who push it. You're going to have the southern states. You're going to have some different rebellions like the Nate Turner against some of the harsh black codes and limited rights. So you've got that going on. And then at the same time, you have the temperance movement, which is going to address the abuse of alcoholism and the abuse of alcohol. So the temperance movement between 1830 and 1840 is, of course, to get rid of alcohol, focus on the Christian family morals, and you can't have this if you have the patriarch drinking alcohol and abusing alcohol and then coming back and abusing family members. So this is going to, all these social movements are going to be inspired from the Second Great Awakening, this religious revival on improving the life of people who are considered disadvantaged, and by removing the temperance movement, by removing alcohol from the family, of course, is going to help support the family better. You have reformers like Dorothy Dix, who are going to attempt to improve conditions in mental hospitals. You have Horace Mann, who's going to work on expanding public education, very much so in training teachers. So you have these different movements that are going to really focus on the working class. You want to reduce drinking, you want to lead to healthier relationships, to more stable lives. And if you can make all of that work, you're going to reform American society, and you're going to have some justice, and you're also going to have equality.